Hey everybody, this is Devin. Today I'm trying something a little bit different. I'm calling this Learning Out Loud because you're going to learn something along with me. I know a lot of new developers learn Bootstrap to make building out their UIs a little bit easier. I've used Bootstrap quite a bit and it's pretty nice. It will help you quickly get together a UI. I think if I were starting over today, I might instead learn Tailwind CSS. And to be 100% transparent with you, I just have this extremely vague idea that Tailwind CSS is something kind of like Bootstrap, but not really. I do know that I want to learn it though, so I'm going to bring you along with me. Let's go over to the computer and get started. Hey everyone, I'm starting out today at the Tailwind CSS website. And we're just going to learn this together. The first thing we need to do is install Tailwind CSS. And they're not really saying this, they're kind of taking this for granted, but you need to install it in whichever project you're going to be working in. NPM installs packages locally to a project by default. So if I run npm install, or Yarn does the same thing. If I run yarn add, and then the name of some package, that gets installed for my current project. So I want to make sure that I have a project that I want to work in and that I'm in that before I run these commands. I'm working on macOS, by the way. If you're on macOS, you can use the Terminal app. I'm going to be using iTerm2, which is a free app that you can download if you want a slightly nicer terminal emulator. On Linux, you'll almost certainly have some sort of terminal emulator bundled with your distro. I'll trust you to figure that out. And then on Windows, if you're running Windows 10, you can install the Linux subsystem to get actual Linux running inside of Windows, and you can use that terminal to do all this, and it will be virtually identical for you. If you don't want to go that far, there are other applications you can download in Windows that will sort of fake the Unix terminal for you, and those will probably be the same for 90, maybe 95% of everything we're doing here. So I'll flip back over to my terminal. Once again, it's iTerm2, and I'm starting in my projects directory. The first thing I want to do is I want to make a new directory for this project I'm going to be experimenting with. So I'm going to make dir, and we'll just call it Tailwind test. Now I need to change into that directory with cd. And now we're sort of ready to go, ready to start doing things. We can use this command to install. I'm just going to copy and paste it right out of here. And now npm will download and install that package in this project. The next step is add Tailwind to your CSS. Use the Tailwind directive to inject Tailwind's base, components, and utility styles into your CSS. We don't have any CSS yet, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull this whole project directory open in Visual Studio Code. I will do that using the command line tools for Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to type code space and then the dot, which means the current directory, and that will open this current directory in Visual Studio Code. And here we are. We have our Tailwind test directory open in Visual Studio Code. The next thing I want to do, we're going to be working with CSS. So I want just a boilerplate HTML file and an empty CSS file that I can start working with, and I want to link the two together. I will start with the HTML file. We're going to call it index.html. I have Emmet installed in my Visual Studio Code, which lets me quickly write out HTML. And one thing that's going to be really useful here that it gives us is it gives us a sort of HTML boilerplate that I can use, so I don't have to type the doc type and the head and body and all that stuff. It just sort of inserts all that for me. And the way I do that is by typing HTML and I can go down to this HTML5 abbreviation and hit my tab key. And now we have that boilerplate. I'm going to change the title to Tailwind Test. And there's one thing missing from this, and that is my style sheet. That is a link tag in the head. Fortunately, Emmett has abbreviations for those because I do not remember what this is. This is something I would have to look up. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. And actually, I'm just going to leave the default there, and we'll just call this style sheet style.css. Saving that document, and we are ready to go with our HTML. Now I'm going to go create this style.css. If this were going to be a big deal project, I'd probably come up with a better way to structure this. And honestly, in most cases, I probably wouldn't be writing out HTML by hand like I am doing here. There might be some sort of dynamic element where that's generated for me. But for a toy project like this, just to get some experience with a new CSS framework, I think this is perfectly sufficient. Now I will flip back over to the documentation and copy and paste these directives. I don't think we need the blank lines between these, so I'm just going to get rid of those. That should give us our start. Back to the documentation, and it tells us that Tailwind will swap these directives out at build time with all of its generated CSS. But what that means is that if you just take a CSS file anywhere on your computer and add these directives to it, they won't work. They only work because we have installed Tailwind CSS for this project. Now we have an optional Tailwind config file that we can create. I'm not sure if we will need that or not, but I'm going to go ahead and create it. That way we will have it if we need to use it later. Again, just copying and pasting these commands. That should give us the tailwind.config.js. If we want to confirm that, we can use ls to list the directory contents, and there we see the file, tailwind.config.js. Everything is working so far, but we haven't really done anything yet. On step 4 here, the first set of instructions, I feel like they've sort of mixed these up a little bit. In all the other steps, the first instruction has been how to install their CLI and how to use their CLI. Now on step 4, we're kind of switching that, and they're telling you how to use it with PostCSS. PostCSS is another command line application that will go through your CSS and do some post-processing on it. Think about Sass and less, except instead of being a sort of different language apart from CSS that gets compiled into CSS, PostCSS works on what is already CSS, but it has a few extra goodies thrown in there that PostCSS can read and process for you. We are not using that method. We've installed the Tailwind CLI, so I'm going to go down to this second instruction on step 4 using Tailwind CLI, npx Tailwind CSS build styles.css -o output.css. All right, let's copy and paste that. Styles.css does not exist. I thought it did. Let's look at our directory again. Oh, style.css is the name of our style sheet. You can press up in the terminal to go through your command history. I want to tweak that last command I ran just a little bit, so I'm going to go back to it in the history. And now I can just arrow over and take the S out of styles. And it builds. One thing to note is that it's saved the output to output.css. That is important for us because that means we have linked the wrong style sheet in our HTML. I'm going back to Visual Studio Code, switching into the HTML, and I'm going to use, I think it's Command B, yeah, to hide the sidebar. I don't really need to look at that file listing all the time. Back in the index, I don't need to link style.css anymore. I need to link output.css because that is the built file. Style.css is the style that we are going to write, and then the Tailwind CLI will build that into output.css, and that is the CSS file the browser will read. I'm going to save that, flip back over to our documentation. There are all sorts of instructions on how to set up different build tools to do this for you. In general, you wouldn't want to just manually run the Tailwind CLI to build your CSS every time. We're only doing that here because we're experimenting. If we were going to use this in a project, we would probably use Post CSS, or we might integrate it with Webpack or Gulp or one of these other build tools, so that as our other assets are built, the CSS and Tailwind are also built at the same time. That is all for our installation. There is one more nice tool though that I might try to install, and that is this IntelliSense. This basically gives us autocomplete inside Visual Studio Code for the Tailwind classes. So let's see if we can install that in code. I'm going to go to my extensions. We're going to search the marketplace for Tailwind. The first result here is Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. Installing that. Looks like it's installed. Should be good there. I'll collapse the toolbar back down. Now that we have everything set up and we're ready to dig in and start using it, I think it's important to understand why would we actually use this over something like Bootstrap or over just writing our own custom CSS for a project. In the documentation, they have a section called Core Concepts, which sort of speaks to the philosophy behind this project. And I think the first one, this Utility First article, is really the meat of it. You can see here they have an example on the top of an alert box that you might create for your web application or your website. And this method they've used to create it is similar to what you might do in a framework like Bootstrap. You have a top-level class that represents what component you want to use, and then you may have classes within that to represent different parts of the component. The problem with this is that the component is fairly opinionated. It's built out in a certain way. If you want it to look exactly that way, then these sorts of frameworks are a super fast way to get that up and running. But once you start trying to tweak and make it your own, things can get a little bit complicated. Now, in addition to applying the styles that you want for your component, you're also having to dismantle all the styles that the UI framework has assumed that you would want for this kind of component. If we keep scrolling, we can see the utility first analog. One thing you'll notice here is there is no CSS. This is all just built with these utility classes. And there's definitely a trade-off here because the class list looks a lot nastier than it did in the previous example. If we keep scrolling, they actually explain some of the utility classes they've used to create this UI. They've used the flexbox and padding utilities, which are represented here, flex and P6. Oh, they've also got this flex shrink 0. They've used max width and margin utilities. That's max WSM and MX auto. In the documentation here, we can click through to any of these to see what those utilities do and how we use them. Here's the documentation for the margin utilities. You've got M dash and then a number, and those numbers map to some default steps that you might want to use for your margins. And those are in rems, so those are tethered to the font size at the base of your document. That means these lengths are still going to be custom in a way to your design because you're going to be setting your base font size, and these are relative to that unit. Here's something that's close to what they used in the example, M auto, which just gives us margin auto, but they use MX auto, and I'm not seeing that, although I do see you can also do negative margins here, so that's useful. Here we go. Here's MX and 0. which sets the margin left and right. That tells me MX is margin on the x-axis only, not on the y-axis. So it's not setting top and bottom margins, only left and right margins. And here we see more examples of that. Here's MY, which sets top and bottom, and then MX1 sets left and right. Probably if we keep scrolling here, we'll see that MX auto. Yeah, here we go. MX auto sets margin left to auto and margin right to auto. Back to the example. This is sort of like using your classes to write recipes for your UI components, whereas Bootstrap is more like ordering out. With Bootstrap, you call up and say, I need an alert box, and Bootstrap delivers you an alert box, and hopefully it's exactly the way you want it, because now it's already made, and it's going to be really hard to extract the melted cheese or whatever ingredient you don't want in there, and to replace it with vegan cheese. That's not an easy change to make. Whereas here with the Tailwind model of utility first, we are starting from nothing and we are just adding whatever ingredients we want. I want the maximum width of this component to be small. I want the left and right margins to be automatic. I want it to display as a flexbox with some padding. I want the background to be white. I want the corners to be rounded, and I want it to have a little shadow on it. One thing that occurs to me as I'm learning about this is it's kind of just like you're writing CSS in your classes. Honestly, I'm not totally sold on it yet, but I really just want to try it. I want to see where the rubber meets the road and how it actually works in practice. I think the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to try to build just some simple component. Let's start by flipping back over to Visual Studio Code. I think the first thing I'm going to try to build is maybe like a sort of card that a blog post might go in. So imagine you had a blog listing that showed all your posts, and maybe each one is on a little rectangular card with an image at the top and then an excerpt down underneath that. Well, the title, and then an excerpt underneath the title. And to get started, I'm just going to rough in some of the HTML that I think might make up that component. That will go in the body. Let's just say div for now. I almost went with an article, but I'm not sure if that's appropriate since it's not going to be the entire article in this card. So I'm not sure about the semantics of that. The first thing we'll have at the top is an image, and I'm going to be using the emit abbreviations on this, so you can kind of see how that works. In addition to an image, we're going to have a heading of some sort. It's probably not the page heading, so it's probably going to be like an H2 or an H3 level heading. We're going to go with H3, and then we're going to have some text, and then probably a link. The way you use emit is you just type out your element names, and putting the plus between them means they're all going to be siblings. They're all going to be on the same level of the document. So now I can just hit tab, and emit will create all of those for me. Just fill in these with some placeholder text. And let me see if I can find some sort of image that would work. I found this site, placeimg.com, and it looks like it has some neat placeholder images you can use in your designs. 640 by 480, I'm not sure if that's quite what I want. We'll do, oh, we can't do 1280. Let's do 1000 by 600 maybe. That should be a nice kind of wide format image. Oh, it's not quite as wide as I would like. 1000 by 400 maybe. What does that look like? Yeah, that's more sort of the aspect ratio I was looking for, something really wide. Okay, now we can just copy this URL, and I'm going to paste it into the source attribute of my image. We'll save that. I have an auto formatter plugin that's going to mess with my code when I save. If yours doesn't do that, don't worry about it. It's not actually changing anything, so it's still the same code. Let's open this in the browser and see what it looks like. I'm going to open File, Tailwind Test, index.html. Okay. The placeholder service generates a different image every time, so every time we refresh this, we're going to get potentially a different image. Not a big deal, because I don't really care what it is. It just needs to be something. Now, I'm going to be going back and forth between the documentation and my code a lot. So I'm actually going to size this up so that it takes up about half the screen, and my editor as well, so that I can have them on each half. Let's see what I need to be looking at. I care about the width of it. Sizing. Under sizing, I have width. The reference is great, but a lot of times I like to just scroll down and look for some examples so I can see it in use. There's width auto, screen width, fixed width. There's customizing width. That's not really what I'm trying to do. Let's go back to that example we were looking at earlier in the article about utility first. How did they size this up? Max W small. So maybe I should be looking at max width instead of width. Max width. Yeah, I like this a little bit better. I don't need to specify the exact width. So I'm going to go to my div here and add a class of max width, probably medium. Let's save that and see what that does to our document. Okay, so that's what we have now. I'm going to refresh. And that's what we have now with our new width. That's roughly what I was looking for to get started. I think I'd like to have some kind of border on this. So let's read about borders and how to do those. Got different styles of borders here, solid, dash, dotted, double. Here's how you use them. Let's start with a border style. We'll go with border solid. And what else about borders? Color would be good. Transparent, current, black, white. Let's go with a green border. Oh, and we can see samples of each of the green colors over here. Let's go with this 300. That might be too light, actually. Let's try the 500. And so that'll be border, green, 500. Let's save that and refresh. That didn't do what I thought it was going to do. Don't see the border. Maybe I'm missing something. Oh, okay. I guess we have to just say border to indicate we're going to have a border first. And then we can start drilling down. Yeah, there we go. Now I'm seeing the border. I might like it to be a little bit thicker. Border width. Let's go with 2 maybe. So border 2. I wonder, does that replace? Yeah, so border gives you width of 1. That's why we didn't see the border before, is because we were setting the style and the color, but the width was still 0. Let's try a 2 and see what that looks like. I like that. One thing I don't like is that there's not really any breathing room between our border and our content. I don't want that for the image. I think I want it right up against the border, but the text I'd like to have a little bit of room there. So let's see about doing that. That's going to be padding. Okay, we've got P-1, 2, 3. Let's try. I would want the same padding on the title and the text, the excerpt text. So maybe it makes sense to put both of those into a single element so that I can kind of group them together and style them together. Let's add a div and move these two elements into it. Now, instead of adding padding to both the heading and to the paragraph, I can just add it to this div. Let's try P-2. I don't really know what that's going to look like yet, so I'm just going to try it, and I can tweak it if it's not enough. I don't think it is enough. Also, I'm noticing now I omitted the link, which probably should be part of that same div as well. So I'm going to pull it up, and now let's double that padding and see how that looks. Might even need more than that. That's not bad. I would still like a little more. Let's double it again. That I like. Okay. One thing I'm noticing is that the headings are not styled in any particular size. There's an article on base styles that recommends how you would go about setting the font sizes for all your headings. If I were doing a big project, I would probably go that route. Where is that base sizing? Actually, I'll just search adding base styles. Yeah, here we go. It's in the example they use, they have set size for the H1 and the H2. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to style it individually. So I'm going to say class equals, and let's look at those text sizing, font size. We have all these classes. We got a 2XL and XL. I don't think this one needs to be super large. Let's try a large. Let's see what that looks like. That may not be quite enough. I'd like it a little bit larger. Let's try an extra large. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Actually, I don't know. I'm second guessing now. Okay, let's try a 2XL. Yeah, okay, that I like better. I would like this paragraph to have some margin underneath. Okay, I would like this paragraph to have a little bottom margin, maybe a little top margin too. Or I could look at that as a bottom margin on the heading. I might do that. So let's just put a little bottom margin on both. These are margins all the way around on every side. And then it looks like they've got these MX and MY, which are going to be Y top bottom, X left right. And I really just want bottom. Here we go. MT for top, MB for bottom, MR for right, ML for left. Let's go MB, let's try 4 there. And then this one, I think I might want a little bit more. Let's try MB8. Let's see what those look like. I like the 8. Okay, it might be too much. Actually, I think I want to go 4 there. And then here, I think I just want to go 1. Maybe a little more than 4. All I'm doing to see my changes is I'm just saving in Visual Studio Code, and then I'm flipping back over to Chrome and refreshing. I think that's pretty good. I think it could be kind of cool if this whole thing had a hover style. so that if you moused over any part of that article card, it would apply some sort of style. And Tailwind has a way to do this. Let me search for hover focus and active styles. Oh, this is a video. I don't know if I want to watch a video right now. I'll just go to their core concepts where they talk about these pseudo-class utilities. The way the utilities work is you can just prefix any of the existing utility classes with the pseudo-class utility, and it will apply it only in that case. Here's an example for a background. They've applied this background only on hover. And then they showed a way to do it on groups too, and that's, I think, what we want to do here. Yeah, this is our group. If you need to style a child element when hovering over a specific parent element, add the group class to the parent element and add the group hover. Yeah, I think, I don't know, do we need to do that? Maybe we don't need to do that because maybe we can just apply it to the whole outer div. We'll try it that way and just see if it works. Okay. And I'm going to do something similar to what they're doing here. I'm going to apply a background color on hover, so I'm just going to kind of, except I want to apply my green. I want the whole thing to become the green that I'm using for the border. I want the whole background to become that color. So let's try that. I'll just start with that and see how this works. Yeah, that does pretty much what I want to do. Now I just need to also change the text color so it's a little bit more readable. That black on top of the dark-ish green is not really contrasty enough, but I think a white text on top of that will read really nicely. Hover, and I'm not sure how to change the text color. But fortunately, it's pretty straightforward. We can just do text white. Let's try this. Yeah, I think that is pretty reasonable. Maybe it should even be a little, maybe the background should be a little darker to make it easier to read. I don't like that color as much, but that one is a nice compromise. Yeah, let's go with that. I would also like this read more link to look more like a button, to be styled more like a button. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that. It's going to start with a border. We'll do width of 2, solid, just like we did for the outer border. I'm just going to see what that looks like. Okay. The color is not very readable against the white. We may just do a darker gray. I'm going to look up border color here. This gray 500 would probably be a good one. Let's see what that looks like. Oh, okay, I misspelled the class, so nothing happened. Let's try that again. Yeah, that's more readable. It's not really what I was hoping for, though. I want this, I think I just want like a splash of color down there. So maybe instead of using a border to achieve the button look, maybe I need to use a background. And what is that? Background, BG dash, and then the color. I think I'll go with the green 600 that I used in the background for the hover style of the whole card. And then the text color. What was that style again? Or what was that class? Text white. Text white. Let's see what that looks like. This is going to need some work. Yeah. There's no padding here, so it definitely needs something extra. Let's add some padding. We'll start with 4. That's not bad. And maybe rounded borders would be nice for this button. Rounded corners. Oh, that's really straightforward. Just rounded, and then you can indicate how rounded you want them. Maybe just the standard rounded is good enough for this. Let's try it. That's nice. When you hover the card, though, it's a problem because then you can't really see the button anymore. At this point, I probably do need a group. Group hover is really what I'm trying to do here. Let's give this div, this outer div, the group class. And then down here on my button, group hover. And what I would want is I would want the background maybe just white, and then the text black. Oh, but that won't work. I need the group hover utility in front of each one of those. Let's try this. That did not work, and I'm not sure why. Okay, it took a little bit of tinkering to figure out what was happening with my component, why the hover styles weren't working exactly the way I wanted them to, but I think I've got it working now. I'll show you here. Oh, actually, I'm going to get rid of that DevTools panel. And now let's hover, and you can see the background changes colors, the text color changes, and the button color changes so that you can still see it on top of the green background. The reason that wasn't working before is this little paragraph hidden here under group hover. It says you can control whether group hover variants are enabled for a utility in the variants section of your tailwind.config.js file. And then it shows this example where they have enabled responsive, hover, focus, and group hover for the text color utility. What I feel like they forgot to say, though, is that you have to do that or else group hover will not work. So here's what I did. Over in Visual Studio Code, I opened this tailwind.config.js that we created earlier, and I added group hover as a variant for both text color and background color because we need to change both of those on the button. At first, here's the mistake I made. At first, I just did this and just enabled group hover. That made the group hover portion of the styles work. So then when I hovered over the box, it would change the color of the button to white and the text on the button to black. But it did not change the background color of the entire card like it had before. And that's because in defining these, anything that's not in those arrays is excluded. So here what I've done is I've said to generate variants for text color on group hover and for background color on group hover, but for nothing else. So the hover variants were no longer being generated. And since the hover variant is what I'm depending upon to get the overall div's background color and text color to change, those changes disappeared. Once I figured this out, though, I added those variants. I went back to my terminal and I ran my build again through the Tailwind CLI. And that's just getting back to this command in your history and pressing enter return to get a new build. Now we can go over here, refresh, and everything works as intended. One thing I thought was really cool about this system is that if you have a component like this card, specifically the div part of this card, which kind of has starting to get a little unwieldy. It's got quite a few different classes applied to it. if you've got something like that that you're going to be using a lot, and I probably would in a use case like this, because I'm going to have multiple articles that are each going to be excerpted on my listing page in this same way through this same card. They have a way to sort of alias all those classes and bundle them up together. So then you can create things that are sort of like the components that you get with Bootstrap, but they're completely customized to whatever you want to build in your UI. They tell you how to do it under core concepts here in the documentation, extracting components. You can do it with this apply directive. And here's an example of how that works. You set up a rule in your style sheet with the name of the class you want to use, and then you use the @apply directive, and then you put the names of all the classes that should be bundled up into that new class. Let's try this really quick for our card element and just see how this works. I'm going to grab all of my classes out of here, go over to my styles. We're going to call this an article card. And paste it in all of my classes that I want to use for this component. @apply, and then I need a semicolon at the end. That should work. Now let's go back over here and, oh, actually, I should have left those selected, because now I can just say article card, and that should bundle up everything. Now I haven't actually tried this yet, but I'm thinking if I go back over here and refresh, it's going to break everything. Let me see if that is the case. Yes, I no longer have my card, and here's why. The apply directive is not part of CSS. It's something in Tailwind, which means in order to work, I have to build this through the Tailwind CLI. Let's go back to my terminal. I'm just going to run that same command again to rebuild. Oh, apply cannot be used with .group because .group either cannot be found or its actual definition. Oh, okay. That is telling us we cannot include the group class when we use apply. So what I'll have to do is I will have to also add group and then article card to get all the styles. That makes sense because the grouping isn't really an innate part of the card. It's not a part of the style of the card. So I think that makes some sense. Let me save that without group and see if it will build. No. Apply cannot be used with hover. Let's dig into that one. I'm not sure why that wouldn't work. Oh, okay. Well, here's our answer. Note that variants like hover, focus, and screen can't be applied directly, so instead apply the plain versions of the utility to the appropriate pseudo selector or media query. Ah, okay. You can see in the example how they're doing this here. They've just got a separate style declaration for the hover styles, and they bundle those up with that. So let's do that. We're going to have another rule here, article card hover. And I'm just going to grab everything, and then I'll take out what we don't need, which is going to be most of it. And we don't need the hover anymore because that's built into our selector. So we just need background green and text white. Now we need to get rid of those altogether out of this one. I would guess we'll need to build again, so let's do that. In fact, I'm sure of it since it never built properly the first time. Now we should be able to refresh. Okay, and now we see the same thing we had before, but what's nice about this is if we want to drop in another one of these, at least for that top level div that wraps the whole card, it's pretty easy. We don't have just this massive list of classes, we just have the two. Let's save that and see what that looks like. This is not going to be great because they're just going to stack on top of each other. They've got the same image. But anyway, Makes it a little bit more reusable, especially if you're writing some of this HTML out by hand. Now that we have a couple of these cards, let's try to make a container to put them in. I'm going to make this a main element because I'm just guessing that whatever ends up being on this page, this is going to be the main portion of it. We'll save that. We can refresh, but it's not going to change anything. We've basically just wrapped it in a component with no sort of styling, in an element with no styling or anything. What I think I would want to do is I would like this to be a flexbox and to lay them out horizontally and just start wrapping if we get too many to fit on a single line. So let's see how we will do flex. Okay, that's the inner flex, but then there's a display flex that I think is just, let's see, display. Yeah, it's just the flex class. That main is going to be a flex container, so we'll give it the flex class. Let's see what that looks like. They're already laid out horizontally, so a lot of the work is already done. Now we just need to figure out spacing and padding and that sort of thing. Let's give it a padding of 6 all the way around. Okay. They need some spacing between 2, though. To space those out, I think I'm going to use this space between utility, and I want X. So I want to put space between them on the X-axis so that horizontally there's a little bit of spacing between each card. Let's try 2. That's okay. I think it probably needs to be more than that, probably 4. That's better. I might even go a little bit more. Let's see what A looks like. Yeah, I like that. And now let's add another one just to see how that would work. Just going to copy, paste everything, and refresh. Okay, we don't have flex wrap turned on, so however many we add, it's just going to squish them into that single horizontal row. Let's go back to flex wrap, and we just say flex wrap on the container. Go back up to main, and I'm going to kind of try to group the flexbox properties together. Let's see what that looks like. Okay. 2 things happening here. Now with flex wrap turned on and the window sized as it is, we don't have enough room for 2 of the cards on the same row. It looks like that space between utility just gives a left margin to every child that's not the first, which means that the first item on our second row is going to have that spacing built into the left side of it, which is not great. And this is not a problem specific to Tailwind. This is just a thing that you always deal with when you're working with Flexbox. Stuff is going to wrap and you don't know where it's going to wrap. So how do you put spacing between it in such a way that when it wraps, the new row doesn't have just this phantom space over to the left of it? I'm not sure it's inside the scope of this video to fix that problem, but let's see if we can at least get 2 of them on a single row. And it looks like we did using that space X4. And that reveals a new problem, being that there is no vertical spacing. So when you have 2 rows, the 2 rows bump right up against each other. But maybe we just change this to space 4 instead of space X4. Oh, that did not work at all. So apparently that is not a thing. Yeah, it looks like you have to define the X and Y spacing separately. So let's keep that space X 4. Let's try space Y 4. Why not? Okay. That looks better. We still have the problem on the left side on the second row, but at least the rows have a little bit of separation between them. One way we might be able to deal with that second row problem in this layout, justify content. Yeah, let's try this. You can do space between, and that might work. And then let's get rid of these spacing classes. That did not work. Oh, sorry, I used the wrong class name. So it's justify between rather than space between. There we go. That works. We still need that vertical spacing though. So let's say space Y4. Okay, that gets us pretty close. What this is going to do is as you start stretching your rows, but you can't yet fit another card, then they're going to get really far apart. The cards are going to get really far apart, which you see there, until one pops up. Also, I'm noticing the space between Y doesn't work really well with two cards on the same row, because the first one does not get the Y margin and the second one does. Those are definitely some things that need to be tweaked a little bit. But again, none of that's specific to Tailwind. That's all just CSS flexbox stuff that you're always going to deal with no matter where you're using flexbox. That's a quick intro to Tailwind CSS. I really enjoyed playing with this. I get the same sort of satisfaction out of this as I do just tweaking CSS on its own. So I'm still not sure how useful this is going to be to me, but I do enjoy it. I can see some utility in being able to kind of have a framework around building your own UI framework. I hope that you learned something and you got something out of this too. Thanks for coming along with me on that learning journey. Now you know the basics of Tailwind CSS. Thanks for joining me, and I'll talk to you soon. Mama.